if you're anything like me, and you think about philosophy a lot, you've probably found yourself wondering about that big question, the meaning of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anyone with, a philosophical mind has probably spent some time pondering, is there even such a thing as the meaning of life? What could it possibly be? And, how do we even go about trying to find it if it's out there?
Right, exactly. And so that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today, how contemporary analytic philosophy tackles these really tough issues.
Yeah, and to get into this, we're going to be looking at the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the Meaning of Life.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a great source for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just some, obscure philosophical backwater. This is right at the heart of a lot of debates within, what we call Anglo-American, Australasian philosophy.
Yeah.
So,
So this is like a mainstream topic in philosophy.
yeah, exactly. It's a very active area of research, and, we're trying to get a snapshot of what's going on in that conversation right now.
Cool, cool. And for people listening, this deep dive is really your shortcut to understanding all the key ideas and debates on this big question of meaning in life without having to, wade through all the dense philosophical jargon.
Right. And to help us get through this huge topic, we're going to use three main guiding questions to kind of structure our thinking.
Okay, sounds good.
What are those? Yeah. So first, we're going to ask, what do we even mean when we talk about life's meaning?
Hmm.
Kind of like taking a step back and analyzing the very concept we're dealing with.
Okay, so that's the meta question, right? Like
Yeah.
before we even get into the theories of meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second big question is, okay, if there is such a thing, what actually makes a life meaningful? Like what are the criteria? What are the ingredients of a good life?
Right, and that's where all the, the substantive theories of meaning come into play, right?
Precisely. And then the third question, which, is kind of the elephant in the room, is, well, is life actually meaningful at all?
Yeah, that's the challenge posed by nihilism, right?
Yeah, exactly. The idea that maybe at the end of the day, there's no real meaning to be found.
Right. Okay, so a lot to unpack there. And I guess it's also worth noting that we're going to be looking at this topic primarily through the lens of analytic philosophy.
Yeah, that's right. Although, there are definitely insights to be gleaned from other philosophical traditions, like continental philosophy, Eastern philosophy, as well as from, non-philosophical fields like psychology or even, religious studies.
Right, for sure.
But, for the purpose of this deep dive, we're going to kind of stick with the tools and the style of analytic philosophy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's a good framework for this kind of discussion, and it will help us stay focused.
Exactly. All right, so let's get into that first question then. When we're talking about meaning in the context of life, what are we really getting at?
Right. Yeah, it's almost like we need a definition of meaning before we can even talk about the meaning of life.
Right. And a good place to start, as analytic philosophers is by looking at the language itself.
Okay, so, breaking down the words.
Exactly. And we often see words like important, significance being used kind of interchangeably with meaningfulness.
Right. Yeah, they seem to get at a similar idea.
They do, but it's worth noting that some philosophers have pointed out some subtle distinctions between these terms.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So what would be an example of that?
Well, let's take Singer, for instance. He argues that an action can have, a huge impact on the world. It can be hugely significant in terms of its consequences, but it might not necessarily contribute to an individual's sense of meaning in their own life.
Okay. Yeah, I think I see what you mean. So, like, you could imagine, like, a political leader who makes decisions that affect millions of people.
Exactly.
But maybe those decisions are driven by, power or ambition or something like that. And maybe that leader doesn't actually feel any personal sense of meaning from those actions.
Right, exactly. It's a good example. And then Belliati similarly, makes this distinction between meaningfulness and just simply, caring about something a lot.
Okay, so you could be really passionate about something, but it might not actually be meaningful.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's worth keeping those distinctions in mind as we move forward.
Gotcha. And, another thing that strikes me is how this whole idea of a meaningless life is often linked to other big philosophical concepts, like the absurd or futility.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, and I know there's been some really interesting work on, those topics like Nagel and Feinberg have written about the absurd, right?
Yeah, yeah. And Tricell has written a lot on the idea of futility.
Right. And then there's the question of whether a meaningless life is actually a life not worth living. Thinkers like Landau and Matheson have explored that pretty deeply.
Yeah, and it makes sense that all of these concepts kind of cluster together because they're all in a way about, grappling with the potential lack of ultimate purpose or value in human existence.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, to try and get a better grip on this slippery concept of meaning, we need to think about what philosophers call the bearer of meaning,
Hmm.
right?
Yes, exactly. And so what do we mean by that?
Right. So in other words, are we talking about meaning in life? Like the meaningfulness of an individual human life? Or are we talking about the meaning of life in a much broader
Yeah.
sense? Maybe the meaning of the human species as a whole, or even the meaning of the universe.
Yes, exactly. It's an important distinction. And the focus in contemporary analytic philosophy has really shifted towards that first understanding, the meaning in life, the individual meaning.
Okay, so it's more about like what makes my life meaningful or your life meaningful rather than trying to figure out if the universe has some grand purpose.
Exactly. And there are some good reasons for that shift. One is that it just seems more manageable as a philosophical problem.
Yeah, I can see that it's hard enough to figure out what makes our own lives meaningful, let alone the meaning of the entire universe.
Right. And plus, even if we could figure out that the universe has some objective meaning, it's not immediately clear how that would translate into, meaningful lives for individuals.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you have to start with the individual and then maybe you can work your way up, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And although, it's worth mentioning that there has been some, recent interest in exploring whether non-human animals or even, human infants can be said to have meaning in their lives.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those are interesting questions. Like, what would be the criteria for a meaningful life for, say, a dog or a chimpanzee?
Right. And that's a whole other area that, needs a lot more philosophical exploration.
For sure, for sure. And then, another area that's still relatively under-theorized is the question of whether groups can be bearers of meaning.
Yes, that's right.
Like I'm thinking of, a community that's working together towards a common goal, or even just a really well-functioning organization.
Yeah, and that raises all sorts of interesting questions, like what are the conditions for a group to be considered meaningful? You know, is it just about shared goals or values, or is there something more to it?
Right, right. And like, how would we even measure the meaningfulness of a group?
Exactly. Those are all, open questions for philosophical research.
Cool. Okay. But for the most part, when we talk about meaning in life, we're talking about individual humans.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. That's where the main focus lies.
Okay, so if that's the case, what are some of the common features of a meaningful life?
All right, so there are a few things that philosophers tend to agree on when it comes to this idea of meaning in life.
Okay, so there's some common ground, even if they don't agree on everything.
Exactly. Yeah, and one pretty widely held view is that a meaningful life is generally considered to be something good.
Okay, so it's seen as a positive thing.
Yes, either it's intrinsically good, valuable in itself, or at least it provides us with a really strong reason to act, a motivation to keep going.
Right, so it's not just some neutral thing. It's something that we actually want to strive for.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember as philosophers, we should always, be careful about making generalizations
Right, of course.
because there are some who might disagree with this idea of meaning as something inherently good.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, for example, Mawson and Thomas, they've both suggested that, there might be cases where meaning could be neutral or even, in some really strange circumstances, undesirable.
Oh, wow. That's pretty counterintuitive.
It is, but it's worth keeping those alternative perspectives in mind.
Okay, yeah, I guess it pushes us to really think critically about our assumptions.
Exactly. And then another point of general agreement is that meaningfulness isn't just this all or nothing thing.
Mhm.
It's not like you either have a meaningful life or you don't.
Right, so it's more like a spectrum.
Exactly. Yeah, there are degrees of meaningfulness, and certain activities within our lives, might be more meaningful than others.
Right, and some lives, when we look at them as a whole, might just seem richer and more significant than
Yeah,
others.
exactly. And this kind of fits with our everyday intuitions. We just naturally think of some lives as being, more meaningful than others.
Right, right. And I think this is important to emphasize because sometimes people worry that if we start talking about degrees of meaningfulness,
Hmm.
it leads to some sort of judgment or ranking of people.
Yes, and that's a valid concern, but it's crucial to distinguish between a life being judged as less meaningful and, its moral standing.
Okay, so you're saying that a life can be less meaningful without being less valuable morally.
Exactly right. And philosophers are generally pretty clear on this.
Yeah.
We can hold the view that some lives are less meaningful without in any way implying that those individuals are less deserving of respect or dignity.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really important point to clarify, I think.
Absolutely. And another thing that often trips people up is the relationship between meaningfulness and happiness.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because we often think that a happy life must also be a meaningful life.
Right. And it certainly can be, but the two aren't necessarily the same thing.
So they can come apart.
Exactly. And there's a famous thought experiment by Nozick that illustrates this really well. It's called the experience machine.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
So basically, imagine a machine that can give you any experience you want, perfectly simulated so it feels completely real.
Right, so it's like ultimate virtual reality.
Exactly. But the catch is that you're plugged into this machine.
Mhm.
You're not actually living those experiences in the real world.
Okay, yeah, so it's like you're living in a perfect fantasy, but it's not real.
Right. And so the question is, would you choose to plug into this machine and live a life of pure simulated pleasure?
That's a tough one.
It is. And for a lot of people, the answer is intuitively no.
Yeah, I think I would say no, too.
And the reason why so many people reject the experience machine is that it just feels like something's missing.
Yeah.
Even though you'd be perfectly happy and content in that simulated world, it just doesn't feel like a genuinely meaningful life.
Right, feels kind of empty in a way.
Exactly. And so what Nozick is getting at here is that there's something about actually engaging with the real world, with all its challenges and uncertainties, that seems essential for a meaningful life.
Okay, so meeting requires some sort of authenticity or realness.
Exactly. And it's not just about happiness. It's about, actually making choices, facing consequences, and, kind of creating your own life story in the real world.
Right, and I guess the same goes for the relationship between meaning and morality.
Yes, that's right.
We might think that a morally good life must also be a meaningful life.
Yes.
But those two can come apart as well.
Absolutely. And, you could imagine someone who dedicates their life to, a really noble cause, but maybe they have to make some morally questionable decisions along the way.
Right, like a revolutionary leader who uses violence to overthrow a corrupt regime.
Exactly. And or you could think about someone who's deeply involved in, groundbreaking scientific research, but maybe their work isn't primarily motivated by ethical concern.
Right, like maybe they're just driven by curiosity or a desire to understand the universe.
Precisely. And so while extreme and persistent unhappiness or, deeply immoral behavior might ultimately undermine the meaningfulness of a life, the concepts themselves, meaning happiness, morality, they're logically distinct.
Okay, yeah, I was
Yeah.
trying to see how these different pieces fit together.
Good. And so this brings us to the next question, if meaning in life is this good thing that's distinct from happiness and morality, what are some of the things that actually generate it?
Right, yeah. What are the sources of meaning, so to speak?
Well, a good starting point is often called the classic triad, the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Oh, I've heard that before.
Yeah, it's kind of a classic philosophical framework.
So remind me what each of those represents.
Right. So the good often refers to things like, beneficent relationships, altruistic actions, moral endeavors in general.
Okay, so like helping others, being kind, things like that.
Exactly. And then the true encompasses things like intellectual pursuits, seeking knowledge, understanding the world.
Okay, so like science, philosophy, education.
Exactly. And then the beautiful relates to creativity, aesthetic appreciation, creating or recognizing beauty in its various forms.
Okay, so like art, music, literature.
Precisely. Now, it's important to remember that these aren't meant to be exhaustive categories. There might be other sources of meaning that don't neatly fit into this triad.
Right, right. And plus there's probably a lot of overlap between these categories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that actually brings us to another key debate in the philosophy of meaning in life. Is it a single unified thing, or is it more like a collection of different ideas?
Okay, so is it monistic or pluralistic?
Exactly. And some philosophers argue for a pluralistic view. They say meaningfulness is really a cluster of related but distinct elements.
Okay, interesting. So what would be some examples of those elements?
Well, some common ones include fulfilling important purposes,
Right.
having a positive impact on the world, experiencing transcendence, making sense of your life story.
Okay, so it's like a bunch of different things that can contribute to a meaningful life.
Exactly. And thinkers like Marcus Thompson and Metz, they often lean towards this pluralistic understanding.
Okay, and then on the other side you have the monistants.
Right. And they argue that there's some single underlying property that makes a life meaningful.
Okay, so it's like a more unified concept.
Exactly. And so, for example, Taylor suggests that it's about deep and sustained devotion to objectively superior goods.
Okay, and what would those be?
Well, he doesn't really give a definitive list, but, you could think of things like truth, justice, beauty, love, those kinds of really fundamental values.
Right, right. And then Levy talks about transcending our inherent limitations.
Exactly. And Martella focuses on making a significant contribution to something larger than yourself.
Okay, so there's a lot of variation, even within the monistic camp.
Absolutely. And then there's another interesting development in the field that's kind of shaken things up. It's called the interpretive turn.
The interpretive okay, what's that all about?
Yeah. Well, this perspective argues that when we're talking about meaning, we're essentially talking about making sense of a life within a broader frame of reference.
Okay, so it's about intelligibility or coherence.
Exactly. And this could be a narrative framework, like a story that we tell about our lives.
Right, so it's like our lives have to have a plot or a theme.
Exactly. And or it could be an explanation of our origins and ultimate destiny, like where we came from and where we're going.
Okay, so that's more like a cosmic or metaphysical framework.
Right. And thinkers like Goldman Sechrest and Thomas have been really influential in developing this view.
Okay, and what's the appeal of this interpretive turn?
Well, one of the main attractions is that it seems to offer a way to unify all these different uses of the word meaning.
Right, because we talk about meaning in so many different ways. Like the meaning of a word, the meaning of an event, the meaning of a life.
Exactly. And the interpretive turn suggests that there's this underlying idea of making sense within a larger context.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that could be unifying.
But of course, no philosophical theory is without its critics.
Of course.
And some argue that this interpretive turn struggles to capture, that gut feeling we have that a meaningful life is also a good life.
Right, so it might be able to explain how we make sense of our lives, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why that's a good thing.
Exactly. And plus, some critics worry that it kind of downplays the importance of experience, like this profound moments that might resist easy interpretation.
Right, so like you might have an experience that's deeply meaningful to you, but you can't really put it into words or fit it into a neat narrative.
Exactly. And then finally, there's this concept of anti-meaning.
Anti-meaning, what's that?
Yeah, so it's kind of the flip side of meaningfulness. It's about those things that actually detract from a life's overall meaning.
Okay, so like the bad stuff.
Yeah, and Metz and others have argued that things like gratuitous cruelty, pointless destruction, the violation of fundamental values.
Right, so things that are just wrong.
Exactly. They're not just neutral. They actually diminish the meaning that a life might otherwise have.
Okay, so it's like negative meaning.
Exactly. And so even though there's still a lot of debate about, how to define meaning in life, there's this broad agreement that it's a valuable dimension of our existence. It's distinct from happiness and morality, and it's something that we should strive for.
Right. Okay. That's a good foundation to have.
Hmm.
Now let's move on to that second big question. What actually makes a life meaningful?
Right. So that's where all the different theories come in. The attempts to explain how a life becomes meaningful.
And I guess it's worth mentioning that just like in ethics, where you have people who are skeptical of moral theories, you also have philosophers who are skeptical of theories of meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are what we might call anti-theorists in the philosophy of meaning.
Okay. And what's their argument?
Well, thinkers like Cakes and Hosseini, they argue that, the conditions for a meaningful life are just too diverse and context dependent to be captured by any single theory.
Oh, okay. So they're saying it's just too messy to try and come up with a grand unified theory of meaning.
Exactly. Yeah. And they might point to the fact that what's meaningful for one person could be completely meaningless for another. It really depends on individual values and circumstances.
Right, right. I can see that. And I guess you could also argue that meaning is something that evolves over time. What's meaningful to me now might not be meaningful to me 10 years from now.
Exactly. Yeah. So the pursuit of a unified theory of meaning is still, a relatively young and evolving field within philosophy.
Okay, so lots of room for debate.
Absolutely. And the various theories that have been proposed, they're often grouped together based on their underlying metaphysical commitments.
Okay, so like whether they rely on supernatural beliefs or not.
Precisely. So we have supernaturalist theories, which basically say that a spiritual realm or a connection to the divine, is essential for life's meaning. And then we have naturalist theories, which emphasize the physical world as the basis for meaning.
Okay, so supernaturalism versus naturalism.
Exactly. That's the main divide. And there's also logically speaking, the possibility of non-naturalist theories, which would ground meaning in some kind of abstract properties or values that are independent of both the physical and the spiritual.
Okay, so that's like a third option.
Yeah, but to be honest, non-naturalist theories haven't really gotten much attention in recent analytic philosophy.
Oh, okay, so it's mainly a debate between supernaturalism and naturalism.
Yeah, for the most part. And it's also really important to distinguish between supernaturalism and theism.
Okay, yeah, what's the difference there?
So supernaturalism is a broader category. It just means that there are, some spiritual conditions that are either necessary for meaning or that significantly enhance meaning, like a connection to a higher power or the existence of a soul.
Okay, and theism is more specific.
Exactly. Theism is just the belief in God or gods.
Okay, so you can be a supernaturalist without being a theist.
Right. You could believe in, spirits or karma or some other kind of spiritual force without necessarily believing in a personal God.
Right, right, that makes sense.
Okay, so within supernaturalism, we see this further distinction between what philosophers call extreme and moderate views.
Okay, extreme versus moderate supernaturalism. What's the difference?
So extreme supernaturalism takes this really strong stance. It says that spiritual conditions are absolutely necessary for any kind of genuine meaning.
Okay, so without God or a soul, life is just meaningless.
Exactly, that's the claim.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and moderate supernaturalism, takes a bit of a softer approach.
Okay, how so?
Well, moderate supernaturalists, they argue that spiritual conditions are required for like great or ultimate meaning,
Yeah.
but they allow for the possibility that some degree of meaning, maybe a more limited kind of meaning can still be found in a purely secular context.
Okay, so they're not saying that atheists can't have any meaning at all.
Right. They're just saying that God or a soul kind of raises the ceiling on the meaningfulness of a life.
Okay, I see. And so what exactly do they mean by this great or ultimate meaning?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are different ways that philosophers have tried to characterize it.
Okay, so like what are some of the common ways?
Well, some say that ultimate meaning is infinite in scope. It extends beyond our finite existence.
Okay, so it's not limited by time or space.
Exactly. And others say that it's about having a deeper, more profound kind of meaning, something that really gets to the heart of who we are.
Okay, so it's not just about superficial pleasures or achievements.
Exactly. And then there's the idea that ultimate meaning is unlimited in its potential. It's something that can continue to grow and develop even after we die.
Okay, so it's not like a fixed goal that we can reach.
Yeah.
And then that's it.
Right. And then some philosophers connect ultimate meaning to the idea of eternity. Like it's something that's only possible if we have an immortal soul.
Okay, so it's tied to the afterlife.
Exactly. And then finally, some philosophers talk about meaning from a universal or even a divine perspective.
Okay, so it's about how our lives fit into the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing is that even though there's all this talk about ultimate meaning, the philosophical literature hasn't really done a good job of, teasing apart all these different ways of understanding it.
Okay, so there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of clarifying what we mean by ultimate meaning.
Exactly. Yeah. And then within supernaturalist theories, you can also distinguish between God-centered views and soul-centered views.
Okay, so is the focus on God or on the soul?
Right. In God-centered views, they basically say that meaning comes from, some kind of relationship or connection with God or from fulfilling God's purpose.
Okay, so like being a good Christian or Muslim or whatever your religion is.
Right. And soul-centered views, they focus more on the nature and destiny of the individual soul, particularly its immortality.
Okay, so it's more about what happens to us after we die.
Exactly. And of course, many supernaturalist thinkers believe that both God and the soul are important for meaning. It's not always an either thing.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
So let's start by looking at some of the God-centered views.
Okay, sounds good.
The most extreme version, says that the meaning of life comes from fulfilling a purpose that's assigned by God.
Okay, so it's like we're all actors in a divine play.
Exactly. And God is the playwright and the director. And, our job is just to play our roles as best we can.
Okay, and what's the argument for this view?
Well, the main idea is that only God's purpose, can provide a truly objective and ultimate grounding for meaning.
Okay, so it's like without God, there's no way to know what's truly valuable or important.
Right, because, our human values, they're always kind of subjective and changeable.
Right, right. So we need something outside of ourselves to provide a stable foundation for meaning.
Exactly. And some people argue that, only God can provide that kind of foundation.
Okay, but that seems like a pretty big assumption.
It is, and there are a lot of philosophical criticisms of this extreme God-centered view.
Okay, like what are some of the main ones?
Well, one objection is that it doesn't seem to account for, all the non-moral sources of meaning that we talked about earlier.
Right? Like, intellectual discovery or artistic creation, they don't necessarily seem to be tied to a divine moral plan.
Exactly. And plus, there are other ways to account for objective morality and value, without having to appeal to God.
Right, so like naturalism or non-naturalism.
Exactly. And then there's the famous degradation objection, which was articulated by Sartre and then later by Bayer.
The degradation objection. Okay, I haven't heard of that one. What's that all about?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that if we're created with a predetermined purpose by God, it kind of undermines our human dignity and autonomy.
Okay, so we become like puppets.
Exactly. And the worry is that, if our lives are just following a script that's been written by someone else,
Yeah.
then we can't really be said to be creating our own meaning.
Right, it's like the meaning is imposed on us rather than chosen by us.
Exactly. And that's seen as a problem for a lot of philosophers.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then there's another influential extreme God-centered view that was championed by Nozick.
Okay, knows it. What did he say?
Well, he focuses on the idea of God as an infinite and perfect being.
Okay, so God is like the ultimate source of meaning.
Exactly. And his argument goes like this, for any finite source of meaning that we can think of, we can always ask, okay, but what gives that thing meaning?
Right, so it's like a chain of meaning.
Exactly. And so Nozick argues that this chain of meaning, it can't just go on forever. It has to have a stopping point.
Okay, and that stopping point is God.
Exactly, because God is, by definition, infinite and self-sufficient.
Okay, so God's meaning doesn't depend on anything else.
Precisely. And that makes God the ultimate ground of meaning for everything else.
Okay, I see. But isn't that assuming a lot about the nature of God?
It is. And there are definitely counter-arguments to Nozick's view.
Like what?
Well, one objection is that, maybe finite things can just be inherently meaningful, without having to derive their meaning from something else.
Okay, so it's like saying that a beautiful sunset or a kind act can be meaningful in themselves.
Exactly. And another objection is that, maybe there are finite values that can ground meaning, even if those values aren't themselves meaningful.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow that one.
Yeah. So imagine the value of helping others. That could be seen as a finite value,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be grounded in something else. It could just be valuable in itself.
Right, right. And then that value of helping others, could be a source of meaning for our lives.
Exactly. And so you don't necessarily need an infinite God to provide the ultimate foundation for meaning.
Okay, that's interesting. And then I guess one of the obvious challenges to these extreme God-based views
Yeah.
is that there are lots of people who live seemingly meaningful lives without believing in God.
Absolutely. And I mean, you think of people like, Albert Einstein
Yeah.
or Mother Teresa or Pablo Picasso.
Yeah, all these people who made huge contributions to humanity.
Exactly. And it seems like their lives were deeply meaningful,
Mhm.
regardless of whether or not they believed in God.
Right, so that kind of casts doubt on the idea that God is strictly necessary for any kind of meaning.
Exactly. And that's one of the main reasons why many contemporary supernaturalist philosophers have moved towards more moderate God-centered views.
Okay, so they're still saying that God is important for meaning.
But they're not saying that it's absolutely essential.
Okay, so how do these moderate views work?
Well, the basic idea is that God enhances meaning, even if it's not strictly necessary for any meaning at all.
Okay, so God is like a bonus.
Exactly. And there are different ways that this enhancement can play out.
Okay, so like what are some examples?
Well, one common idea is that God provides a sense of ultimate meaning and purpose.
Okay, so it's like our lives have a cosmic significance because they're part of God's plan.
Exactly. And Swinburne has argued for this view. He says that God's plan gives our lives a kind of narrative coherence.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then another idea is that it's meaningful to strive to please a perfect and all-good being.
Okay, so it's like we're trying to live up to God's standard.
Exactly, and Cottingham and Williams have both suggested this.
Okay, and then there's the idea that God can satisfy our deepest human desires, for connection, purpose, and lasting value.
Right, that's been proposed by Gut, Seacrest, and Cottingham.
Okay, so God is like the ultimate source of fulfillment.
In a way, yes. But even these more moderate views, they still face philosophical objections.
Oh, of course.
And one counter-argument is that maybe the very idea of being alone in the universe,
Yeah.
it actually enhances our sense of significance and responsibility.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like if there's no God, then our choices really matter.
Exactly, and Kahan has argued for this view.
Okay.
And then another worry is that the potential for greater meaning that comes from God, you know,
Yeah.
it might also come with a greater potential for anti-meaning.
Oh, I see. So, like, if you lose your faith or if you feel like you disappointed God.
Exactly, then that could be a really profound source of meaninglessness.
Right. Okay. So, even moderate God-centered views have their downsides. Okay. So, what about soul-centered views?
Right, so those are the other main type of supernaturalist theory and extreme soul-centered views. They often argue that you need an immortal soul to have any real meaning in life.
Okay. And what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, one common argument is that only the prospect of, permanent impact or lasting significance can make a life truly meaningful.
Okay. So, like, if everything we do just ends when we die, then what's the point?
That's the basic idea, and Tolstoy famously argued for this view.